Motion number 2 on representation of the people. I call the Minister to move the motion. Rushanara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the committee approves the voter identification amendment of list of specified documents, Regulations 2024. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Elections Act 2022 amended the Parliamentary election rules set out in Schedule 1 to the Representation of People Act 1983. This set out the requirement for voters to show photographic identification when voting in person in a polling station in Great Britain. The list of accepted forms of photographic ID is set out in Rule 37 of Schedule 1 to the Act. It includes passports, driving licences, various concessionary travel cards, identity cards bearing the proof of Aid Standard Scheme hologram, such as the Young Scot card or the NUS totem card, blue badges, and the Defence identity card. As set out in our manifesto, this government is committed to improving how voter ID works by addressing the inconsistencies and ensuring legitimate electors are able to vote. We are carefully and thoroughly reviewing the voter ID rules and evaluating how they impacted citizens during the general election. Work is already underway on this evaluation using data gathered at polling stations along with public opinion surveys and qualitative research with electors and the electoral sector. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Electoral Commission has also conducted a thorough review of the 2024 general election. They published an interim report on voter ID in September and a final report on the wider conduct of the polls just today. We will, of course, be carefully considering the findings and recommendations of the Electoral Commission as part of our own review of the voter identification policy, and we will respond formally to both of the Commission's reports in the new year. If in our assessment we find changes are necessary or appropriate, we will bring forward further proposals on the wider voter ID policy in due course. And I do not wish to speculate today on what these might be, but I will, of course, keep the House informed on the outcomes of our work. However, there is a clear gap in the existing provisions that we can and should address now. That is the absence of His Majesty's Armed Forces veteran card from the accepted voter ID list, which is why we made its inclusion on the list and manifesto commitment. The veteran card is a recognition of the service and dedication of our veterans to our country. This is just one of the things this government is doing to honour their contribution. We should not allow the need for fuller consideration of the policy in the round to stop us making a necessary change that will support veterans to exercise their democratic rights. And I know this is a change that members opposite were supportive of when in government, and I hope that consensus remains. This instrument makes changes to the current legislation, which sets out the accepted forms of voter ID, and will result in the veteran card being added to the list of accepted forms of ID for the purposes of voting in Great Britain. It will mean holders of the veteran card can use it to prove their identity when voting in person in polling stations for all elections from May 2025 onwards. The veteran card was fully launched in January this year and is now available free of charge to all veterans. This, alongside the already accepted Defence Identity Card, will bring parity between veterans and serving armed services personnel when voting. And the regulations also make two further small changes. They are technical clarifications to support the smooth and consistent application of the law. These have been highlighted by electoral administrators operating the policy in practice. Firstly, they provide clarification regarding the entry relating to Commonwealth passports by updating the entry to refer to the specific list of Commonwealth countries in the British Nationality Act 1981. This will make the voter ID legislation consistent with electoral registration legislation. In particular, This will allow Zimbabwean passports to be used as identification at the polling station from May 2025. Secondly, the regulations vary the entry relating to the Scottish National Entitlement Card. As currently drafted, the legislation lists this document under the section referring to concessionary travel passes. These regulations will amend this, so this card, which can be used for a number of purposes, is listed elsewhere and makes it clear that those issued for non-travel purposes should also be accepted. Finally, the regulations contain updated prescribed forms of the poll cards sent out to electors ahead of an election. This is in order to update the section that provides guidance to electors on the voter identification policy to reflect the changes I've set out. In implementing our manifesto, Madam Deputy Speaker, to that commitment to add the veteran card to the list of accepted identification for voting, this is an important first step to a much broader programme of work to open up participation in our democracy. This government was elected on a manifesto for change. Alongside our commitment to reviewing and amending the voter ID rules, we have an ambitious and exciting programme to strengthen and widen our vibrant democracy. This includes the introduction of votes for 16 and 17-year-olds for all elections, improving voter registration, and strengthening our political finance framework to protect against foreign interference in our elections. Here and now, the addition of the veteran card supports this important community in engaging in elections and exercising their democratic rights. I'd like to thank all those who've campaigned to make this change a reality, and I hope honourable members will join me in supporting these measures. Thank you.
Very good. The question is, as on the order paper, and I call the Shadow Minister, Paul Holmes.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I welcome, I know she's been in position for 3 months, but I've just joined the Shadow MHCLG team, and I welcome her to her place, and I look forward to working with her constructively in this House over the next few years. Hopefully not too many years on this side, but look forward to working with her going forward, and I welcome her to her position. I am pleased, Madam Deputy Speaker, to confirm that the opposition supports these regulations, which will add the new veteran card to the list of approved photographic identification that can be used for voting at a polling station. The regulations also make small changes to the existing entries regarding Commonwealth passports and Scottish National Entitlement cards on the list of approved identification, which we also support. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am proud that the last government was responsible for introducing the new veteran card, which to help veterans access specialist support and services, including from the NHS, their local authority, and from charities. We all owe a huge debt of gratitude to our veterans, and it is my sincere hope that the Veterans Card is helping make it easier for veterans who need support for issues related to their service to access it in good time. And I am grateful for the Minister for the Armed Forces being here in the Chamber as well to show his support and across government support to thank our veterans for the work that they do. Rolling out the new Veterans Card to around 2 million veterans in the UK represents a vast job, and as I'm sure this whole House will agree, it was absolutely vital that in the last government we got it right, both so that veterans could benefit from the new card as soon as possible, but also that the system can accurately and securely process the large volume of card applications required. In 2019, the government began rolling out the Veterans Card to armed forces personnel who have left since December 2018. And in January this year, following months of testing, the last government launched the online application service so that veterans who left the armed forces before December 2018 can apply. A paper-based application process was also launched, and I take pride in the work undertaken by the last government, including the £3 million investment that made last year to scale up the production of the Veterans Card. Now, as the Minister will know, because of the list of accepted voter identifications was approved by this place and the other place in December 2022, just over a year before the latest stage of rolling out the Veterans Card began, it was not possible to include the card on the original list of accepted voter identification. However, as many of my colleagues made clear, the last government planned to consider adding the new Veterans Card to the list once it had been rolled out. And indeed, my honourable friend, the member for North Dorset, in his role as the former minister before the general election, indeed identified to me this morning that the statutory instrument was drafted and was due to be introduced into this House before the former Prime Minister called the general election. So there is no doubt in this House that the opposition, where we are now, absolutely support the measures and the measures that the government have brought forward this afternoon. It is important that any addition to the list of approved voter identifications reflects the need for these documents to be suitably secure, meaning that they are not easy to falsify or to acquire with false information. This is absolutely vital if we are to secure the integrity of our elections in the way voters deserve, and I'm glad that the new Veterans Card satisfies that requirement and that its addition to the list of approved identifications has been warmly welcomed by the veterans community. I would like to take this opportunity to press the Minister to set out what action the government plans to take to ensure as many veterans as possible are made aware of this addition ahead of polling day for the local elections in May next year. Madam Deputy Speaker, showing identification to prove who you are is something people of all walks of life do every day. On these benches, we firmly believe that carrying out this practice at the polling station is a reasonable and proportionate way to give the public the assurance that their vote is theirs and no one else's. Without a requirement for voter identification, it would be more difficult to take out a library book or collect a parcel at the post office than it would be to vote in someone else's name. And I do understand, and maybe the Minister could outline, that I understand that you even need to present ID to attend Labour Party events. Now, if the party opposite who opposed voter identification in the last Parliament think it's good enough for them and their events, have they now changed their mind about this issue, where even the Electoral Commission says that at the last general election in 2024, 99.92% of people have successfully cast their vote? And in the Minister's opening speech on this legislation, the Minister gave no guarantee about whether the Labour government has fundamentally changed their view on the principle of voter identification. I understand they will need to bring forward minor adjustments to documents that may need to be presented and amended in this legislation, but I would be grateful if the Labour Party or Labour government could confirm now that after opposing this, what I would call a sensible measure, they have now changed their mind and accept that the legislation brought forward under the last Parliament, under the last government, will now stay, and what scrutiny mechanisms she will guarantee to the House this afternoon should the government make their view known that they wish to change the approach that the last government took. As I've previously made clear to this House in 2022 when I spoke in the legislation to introduce this legislation, voting with someone else's voting card is very unlikely to be proven, and the lack of ability to prosecute on that basis is exactly why voter identification is so important. Prior to the introduction of voter identification, the previous security system had seen no significant change since 1872. I hope the Minister can assure me that she is of the opinion that the people of this country deserve elections that are secure and fit for the 21st century. And the Minister will be aware most European countries require some form of identification to vote, and international election observers repeatedly called for the introduction of identifications in polling stations in Great Britain, saying its absence opened the door to electoral fraud. Voter identification has been supported by organisations such as the Electoral Commission and the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Indeed, the Council of Europe's Venice Commission recommends voter identification as part of the gold standard for ensuring that elections are free and fair, saying that it is, and I quote, of paramount importance for the overall integrity of the electoral process. Madam Deputy Speaker, to conclude, as I have outlined, it should not go without saying that electoral fraud undermines the fundamental right to vote in free and fair elections, and it was absolutely right for the last government to stamp out the potential for voter fraud and bring the rest of the UK in line with Northern Ireland, who had had these arrangements before. The opposition supports adding the new veteran card to the list of approved identifications and will closely scrutinise any further announcements from the voter identification scheme. And I hope, after weaving it into her speech when she was speaking at the beginning, we understand that the government has made a commitment for votes at 16. I would look forward to just tempting her to outline to the opposition and to all parties in the House this afternoon if she could go further and outline what scrutiny measures we will have in this House and when we can expect the government to bring those measures forward. Thank you.
Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I pay tribute to the Minister for finding time to bring this SI to the floor of the House. During last May's local elections, multiple veterans reported that they attempted to use the recently launched Veterans Card when voting, only to be told that this didn't count as voter ID, valid voter ID. And this was frankly unacceptable. And as the Shadow Minister rightly highlighted, it's welcome that the Veterans Minister under the previous government pledged to change this in time for a general election. And this statutory instrument before us today fixes this fault, and it sees that veterans that were turned away at the ballot box last May now coming forward, and I expect and hope that the whole House will support this today. But I do urge the government to ensure that this is not the last set of changes we hear on voter ID rules under this Parliament. Madam Deputy Speaker, thanks to the work of tireless electoral administrators up and down the country, I know that the vast majority of our constituents and people were able to vote in the recent general election, but we must not be complacent. We must remember that voting is a right, not a privilege. And we think about when you're doing something as easy as buying a car and how we make sure we are holding our democratic officials to account. But actually, where is that accountability when residents cannot vote, when some of our councils have struggled in terms of making sure that those residents can vote? And we know that some people were sadly turned away from the polling station during this election. And I've spoken to people in my constituency who had issues with postal votes and issues with voting on the day. And it's important that we do look at the rules before us today and making sure our voting system is accessible for everybody, because even if only one legitimate voter is turned away, that's a travesty, and that is an affront on democracy. So I think it is crucial, as the Minister said, when we are looking, Shadow Minister highlighted, and the Minister, when we are extending the right to 16 and 17-year-olds, something that I've long campaigned for, that members in the government should be aware of the anger felt by young people who, at this moment in time, can see other people whose bus passes are allowed as a valid form of voter ID. But if you're a young person who's 18, that same photo ID is not allowed at the ballot box. Make it make sense. And this could be really problematic for 16 and 17-year-olds who, many of them do not carry a photo ID for age verification in comparison to their older peers. But they are likely to have a bus pass for travel to and from college, university or work. But still they can't use that to vote. So therefore I agree with the Electoral Commission that the government needs to look at the list of acceptable forms of voter ID and how we can increase awareness on the uptake of voter authority certificates. I also welcome that the Minister has previously said that this SI is the first and many steps in reforming the voter ID system, and that the government will be publishing an independent evaluation later this year. But I'm also concerned that the wider we leave this reform to voter ID, more and more legitimate voters will fall through the cracks and their voices will not be heard. So can the Minister confirm that this will not be the only reform we see in place before the next set of elections in 2025? And could the Minister also confirm that further changes to the voter ID system will be in effect in time for the 2026 set of local elections? I would also welcome some clarification on the scope of this evaluation. In particular, whether the government are open-minded to introducing maybe photo ID as a form of acceptable ID, maybe scrapping the element to need a photo ID to vote, or even scrapping voter ID in its entirety. And finally, on a wider note, the Minister may be aware that last year the Electoral Commission strategy and policy statement introduced under the previous government, which, if we're honest, was an attack on the independence of the Electoral Commission. And this was widely panned by my predecessor committee, many across from different civic and democratic groups, and the Electoral Commission, and even the Shadow Minister at the time. So can the Minister confirm whether the new government will be scrapping this statement and looking to remove this on the basis of primary legislation during this Parliament?
I come to the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Everyone should have the right to vote. It's a fundamental cornerstone of our democracy. Encouraging voter participation and democratic engagement should be at the centre of every government policy. But political engagement is at a historic low. Voter participation in our recent general election was the lowest since 2001, with fewer than 60% of eligible voters casting their ballot. It's vital that the government do all they can to encourage public engagement in politics. We must act to restore public trust and to ensure that we remove obstacles which prevent people from exercising their full democratic rights. So the Liberal Democrats are very glad to see the government introduce measures which support veterans. Whilst we're pleased that this legislation will make voting more accessible for veterans, we are, however, concerned that this support does not extend to other affected groups. And we call on the government to repeal the voter ID scheme entirely to ensure that all eligible people can exercise their democratic right as easily as possible. On Monday, we marked Remembrance Day. Every year, it serves as a solemn reminder of the bravery and sacrifice of so many who put their lives on the line in the defence of our liberty and our democracy. We must ensure that all of our veterans are properly supported and their work truly recognised. Liberal Democrats support a wide range of measures to support veterans, from ensuring that their impact by the cost of living crisis are getting the support that they need, to doing more for unpaid carers in the armed forces community. And it's shameful that the previous Conservative government originally failed to include Veterans' ID in their list of acceptable identification when they first introduced this legislation. This motion would make it easier for veterans to vote with the expansion of accepted forms of ID at polling stations. And while Liberal Democrats are supportive of measures to support veterans in accessing appropriate identification, we urge the government to remove the requirement for ID altogether. And veterans are being let down. It's a scandal that those who put their lives on the line in the defence of our country too frequently fall through gaps in support. The Liberal Democrats are calling for a fair deal for our veterans and military personnel. This includes placing a legal duty on government departments to give due regard to the Armed Forces Covenant, establishing a centralised information hub for families of service personnel, reaching an agreement with the European Union for reciprocal access to spousal employment for families of service personnel, and cancelling the Conservative government's ill-advised cuts to the army. In 2022, the last Conservative government introduced a new law requiring voters to show photo ID to vote in general elections, local elections and referendums in England. Being able to vote is a fundamental democratic right, yet thanks to the Conservatives, it's now at risk. Millions of voters are affected by this unnecessary and undemocratic requirement. The Liberal Democrats are opposed to the voter ID scheme, and we have called continually for the scheme to be scrapped.
Thank you. I welcome. I'm grateful to the spokesman for giving way. Can I just understand this, because she does have the word Democrat within her name, within her party's name. If her policy was enacted, would mean that people's votes would be able to be taken by other people going to a polling station simply by knowing the name of their next door neighbour and their address. Does she agree with that? And if so, does she not understand that her proposals would actually bring a lack of security to the voting system in this country and would actually encourage fraud and would make sure that results were not as accurate as they could be?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for that intervention, but he will know that the number of incidents of personation, I was just coming to this point, in 2022 was fewer than 13 and no prosecutions have taken place. And yet we know from the Electoral Commission report published just today that, I mean, he may say it's only it's less than 1%, but that results in several thousand people who were unable to exercise their democratic right to vote in the general election because of this unnecessary requirement to produce voter ID. Yeah. So I say to him that, you know, there may well be the risk of voter fraud, but it is yet to materialise in any significant way, and yet we have seen that this measure brought in to combat this supposed risk has resulted in thousands of our fellow citizens being unable to exercise their democratic right to vote. So we are opposed to the voter ID scheme, and we continue to call for it to be scrapped. The shambles of the last Conservative government created a crisis for democracy in this country with their cronyism, rule-breaking, constant sleaze scandals, and public trust in government is worryingly low. Successive Conservative Prime Ministers acted without integrity and treated Parliament and the people with disdain, and the voter ID scheme is just a further example of this. We continue to lead the fight against this deeply unfair, unnecessary and expensive scheme. And the impact must not be underestimated. Every vote matters, and we must ensure that we are not preventing people from making their voice heard. The report published today by the Electoral Commission found that around 4% of eligible people who didn't vote said that was because of the voter ID requirement. More in Common found that 3.2% said they were turned away at least once on July the 4th, which, if reflected across the UK, would equate to more than 850,000 people. Of these, more than half said they either did not return or came back and were still unable to vote. It's important to note that recent figures from London Council show that 3 in 10 Londoners who were turned away from polling stations due to a lack of appropriate voter ID did not return to vote. It's essential that people who have a legitimate right to vote are not prevented from exercising that right. More broadly, voter ID has not impacted all constituents equally.
She said that people have arrived to vote in somebody's name and they've been turned away and then didn't return when asked for ID. How can she be certain that they were the person they said they were?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention. I am quoting, obviously, sources from the Electoral Commission, from More in Common, people who have carried out extensive polling on this question. And people say they were turned away because they didn't have the correct voter ID. I think she's quibbling, frankly. There is no doubt that significant numbers of people were unable to vote in this last election who had the right to do so because of this unnecessary legislation. Research following the general election indicates that voter ID legislation disproportionately impacts minority ethnic groups, with findings by the organisation Hope Not Hate reporting that 6.5% of ethnic minority voters were turned away from a polling booth at least once, compared with 2.5% of white voters. Furthermore, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was a cabinet minister when the voter ID law was introduced, described it as an attempt to gerrymander elections in the Conservatives' favour. Whilst we cannot know how those who did not cast their ballot would have voted, and so cannot directly measure the effectiveness of the deeply worrying intention, research by the Electoral Commission showed that the clearest impact of the voter ID requirement was in relation to social grade. The specification for accepted forms of ID, specifically related to proof of address, has disproportionately affected young people and people living in social housing. We know that the dire economic situation inherited by this government has required the Chancellor to make tough decisions, as we saw with the recent budget statement. Given the need for the government to make spending more efficient, coming to that point, I ask why the government is choosing to keep the voter ID scheme in place. The scheme is projected to cost £120 million over the next 10 years. This is a waste of taxpayer money, and it's an obvious place where the government could save money, redirecting it to support some of the most vulnerable in society or funding towards vitally needed infrastructure projects. More broadly, we are supportive of wider electoral reform and would look to the government to support our pledges to modernise our electoral system. Electoral Commission research shows that across the UK, potentially as many as 8 million people are incorrectly recorded on the electoral register. We should be removing barriers for all voters to encourage voter participation and public engagement. Improvements in the system could be achieved through modernisation of the registration system, such as a requirement on public bodies to share data with electoral administrators to improve the accuracy of the register. Given the huge cost of the voter ID scheme, the 120 million over the next decade, we ask the government if these resources could not be better spent in modernising the electoral register, ensuring that all eligible voters are correctly recorded. It's vital that barriers to voting are removed for all eligible voters, and the deeply worrying findings of the Electoral Commission regarding voter registration are addressed. Liberal Democrats want to strengthen democratic rights by expanding political and democratic engagement. We want to extend the right to vote to 16 and 17-year-olds. And I echo the point made by the member for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green about the additional barriers that voter ID will present to younger voters once the right to vote is extended to these younger voters, because they will find it that much harder to find appropriate ID. We call for the government to enshrine the ministerial code in legislation, give Parliament the powers to hold government ministers to account and protect politics from corruption and sleaze. We also want to see this new Labour government be bold in strengthening the power of local authorities who know best what their communities and towns need. At the 2022 elections, there were 13 cases of alleged personation investigated, and no further action was taken in any of those cases. Would the Minister not agree with me that a much more concerning issue is that of an inaccurate electoral register? It's vital that we remove barriers to voting and that we do all we can to ensure that the 8 million people currently not correctly registered are not excluded from casting their ballots. Voter ID, which will cost $120 million over the next decade, is like using a sledgehammer to try and crack a nut. It's a waste of taxpayers' money. Whilst I appreciate the steps this legislation would take to support veterans, this motion does nothing to improve accessibility for many of the most affected communities, such as those renting from a social landlord, the unemployed, lower social grades, disabled people and young people. I question why the government does not remove this barrier entirely, and I urge them to scrap the Conservatives' undemocratic voter ID scheme altogether. Thank you.
Before I just call the next speaker. Order, order. I will now announce the result of today's deferred division on the draft Windsor Framework Non-Commercial Movement of Pet Animals Regulations 2024. The ayes were 412, the noes were 16. So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. I now return back to the representation of the people motion, and I call Kat Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to start by thanking the Minister for bringing this regulation before the House more than 6 months before the next scheduled set of elections. It is a benchmark and good protocol and good practice in the electoral community to bring these changes forward with good notice, because of course it does affect electoral administrators up and down the country. That wasn't something we saw under the last government, with legislation often before the House just a couple of months before administrators were having to implement it. So I want to thank the government for their good notice that they have done with today. Whilst I welcome today's regulations and will be supporting it, there are still some huge gaps in terms of the lack of accessibility of ID for voting. The Electoral Commission's early research has suggested that those that are unemployed, those from lower socio-economic groups and disabled people are struggling to have access to ID that is enabling them to vote, which is reflected in the statistics we saw from the last general election. The Electoral Commission, which is our independent regulator, did an awful lot of good work at that general election to make sure that public awareness about the need for ID actually did reach the vast majority of people. I believe that 87% of people were aware of the policy, but the awareness of the policy fell in certain other groups, particularly amongst young people, where it was just 71%, and those from ethnic minority backgrounds at 76%. So I would call on the Commission to continue to focus on those groups that are more difficult to reach, but also call on the government to support the Commission to be able to do that work in order to ensure that we don't see a repeat of the general election that we had in July, where around 16,000 people did not have the required ID to vote and were turned away at the ballot box, because I think that's a travesty. I'm happy to give way.
I'm very grateful to making a point. I'm just interested to know if, with the report that's come out, I haven't had a chance to see it myself. Northern Ireland, I believe, has had photo ID since 2003, so we have a direct comparison within the UK of a general election that has voters come through, which we can then see and learn, given that we're 2 decades on through that system. Is there any evidence to suggest that Northern Ireland struggled because of what's going on? And given they're 2 decades ahead of England in this case, wouldn't it be interesting to see the comparative data so the government could take that forward and learn from Northern Ireland?
The Honourable Gentleman is testing my memory, because I have read comparative data on Northern Ireland, but it was some time ago, so he's testing my memory here. But I believe that in Northern Ireland it did take several electoral cycles for information to be understood by the electorate and to be used more confidently. But on Northern Ireland, the way in which the free voter ID cards are issued is different to the way it's been issued in Great Britain, which brings me on to the point of voter authority certificates, because one of the things that I felt very disappointed about in terms of the last general election was about the lower than expected take-up of the voter authority certificates. And I think that some of this might be because I don't think we made it as appealing as it could be to have a voter authority certificate. It wasn't necessarily the application process, but I believe that in Northern Ireland it is a sort of plastic card that can be used as ID for other things that are not just voting, whereas the voter authority certificate in Great Britain is a piece of paper which is not something that someone who is, say, for example, 19, 20 years old is going to want to take with them down the local nightclub to try and gain access, whereas a small plastic card is more durable for other purposes as well and therefore had a higher take-up. I wondered if the government minister would be interested in responding to her thoughts to the House about whether or not she thinks that voter authority certificates could be expanded or developed, and we could perhaps learn from parts of the United Kingdom where it has had a higher take-up. On the public opinion data from the general election, we learned that 4% of people who did not vote at the general election said that their decision was related to the voter ID requirement. My concern is that that research suggests to me that there are people who are not turning up at the polling stations. So the data that the government are able to access is from those that turn up to the polling stations and are turned away. I think we're missing a lot of people here who never actually left the house. And certainly from my own experience on polling day, meeting voters who knew they didn't have access to ID, perhaps didn't know about the voter authority certificate and had decided to stay at home. But I approach this in a positive way, and I want to put forward some recommendations and suggestions for the government minister about whether or not we can improve the access to democracy, which is incredibly important. I'm pleased to hear that the government are going to review the list of accepted ID, and I would plead with the minister to look very seriously at ID that is accessible to younger voters, to those with disabilities and those from ethnic minorities, in addition to the veteran card, which I very much welcome today. And one of the things that was debated as the original legislation passed through the House at committee was whether or not there is a way in which we can use registered voters who do have ID, who can prove their identity, to make an attestation at the polling station on behalf of someone who doesn't have accepted ID. It's known as vouching. So, for example, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith has a driving licence, Mr. Smith doesn't, neither of them have passports. They can both go to the polling station together, and she would be able to attest that her husband, who is with her, is who he says he is the entitled voter, and use one ID to vouch for the whole household to ensure that he is not disenfranchised, because that was an example of a case that I came across in my constituency at the election. Turnout at the general election, as has already been said, fell below 60%, which is the lowest level since 2001. It was down 7.6 percentage points on the 2019 general election. And I think that should give us all pause for thought, because I believe we have a crisis of voter participation in this country, with voters who are entitled to vote, who are registered to vote, choosing not to vote. The crisis in this country is not people turning up at the polling station and pretending to be someone who they're not and taking more votes than they're entitled to. It's actually voters who are entitled to vote not voting. And when democracy turnout declines, our strength in our democracy declines with it. So I'm pleased to hear the government talk about strengthening participation in democracy, and I hope that the minister is able to say a little bit more about this in her winding up remarks. Can I ask the minister if she plans to return to the House, and if so, if she has an idea of timescale to add more IDs to the list of acceptable IDs, as well as the Veterans ID? And does she agree with me that to strengthen democracy, we should actually be looking at how to increase voter participation and not placing additional barriers to taking part? And on that point, the electoral roll continues to be deeply inaccurate, and we have the technology now to look seriously at automatic voter registration. The state knows who lives where, who's entitled to vote. Is there a way in which we can ensure that our electoral roll is far more accurate, that it reflects the people where they live, so that actually it's easier for people to be able to vote at a general election? We don't have this. Happy to give way.
And friend for making a really valid and important point. One of the things I had raised with me with a constituent was the fact that by the time they move, before they finished unpacking, they get council tax bill. In the same way we can get their information, should we not register them to vote? The data is there.
The Chair of the Select Committee makes, as you would expect, an absolutely valid point. The reality is that we make it very difficult in this country for people to be able to register to vote. And I think that we can make this more easy, we can make people's lives easier and hopefully encourage participation in democracy. Because as I said, I'm worried about the health of our democracy in this country, and one of the things that worries me most is about the lack of participation in our democracy. Voter turnout on the decline concerns me, and I believe it should concern the whole House. Thank you.
I now come to Jim Allister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome this proposal. Representing a constituency in Northern Ireland, we have had, as has been referenced, voter ID for over 20 years. I must say it works very, very well. And I think it is something that the rest of the United Kingdom could build upon and learn from. The last speaker, the member for Lancaster and Wyre, said that we have a voter ID card. Yes, we do. If you haven't got a passport, you haven't got a driving licence, you haven't got a bus pass or whatever else is on the list, you can apply to the electoral office, supply a photograph, complete a form which a councillor or an MP or a doctor can verify, and then you're issued free with a voter ID card that carries your photograph and your name. And as the member suggested, it's valuable in other regards as well. So I certainly would recommend that as a way to go in respect of these matters. This proposition adds the veterans card as the usable items of identification. And whereas this regulation applies only to GB, upon seeing the regulation, I tabled a question to the Northern Ireland Secretary, and I'm very pleased with his answer, because he has indicated to me that before further elections in Northern Ireland, he proposes to add the veterans card to the list of acceptable documents in Northern Ireland. And that is good, not just because it enhances the parity which should exist, but it affords to veterans and eases their situation when it comes to voting. And I very much welcome that. I listened with interest to the speech of the spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats. And I must say, I do not understand the aversion to voter ID. In Northern Ireland, we have it for 20 years and more because of industrial scale voter fraud, organised in the main, of course, by Sinn Féin, who literally had an army at their back to do the stealing of votes that they were engaged in. And faced with that, it is right to have a system of voter ID. But no party that isn't engaged in cheating or wanting to cheat has anything to fear from voter ID. Will you give way on that point? Yes.
Thank you. I thank the honourable member for giving way, and like him, I share a scepticism over the view of the Liberal Democrats. And the Liberal Democrat spokesman, Madam Deputy Speaker, said there were no convictions for electoral fraud in this country during 21-22, I believe, and I think that's what she said. Actually, there was a case in Eastleigh, my old constituency, and I see the Honourable Lady for Eastleigh is here, who had to complete 50 hours unpaid work for providing a false name at a polling station in Eastleigh in 2022.
And anything that we can do to diminish the opportunities for voter fraud, we should be doing. Why wouldn't we? And therefore I do not understand the reticence about it, yes.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. He mentioned that he doesn't see why political parties who compete fairly should have anything to fear. I put it to him, it's not a fear of political parties, it's much more about upholding the rights of voters. And it is their interests that we need to protect and not the interests of political parties. And that is why we are calling for the abolition of voter ID, although I will say I fully take on board his points about the situation in Northern Ireland.
Well, I must say to the Honourable Lady, we are protecting voters when we protect them against voter fraud. And that's precisely what voter ID does. It is the ordinary citizen that is being protected. The citizen who wants to play by the rules, the citizen who wants to vote properly, the citizen who doesn't want to cheat, who doesn't want to impersonate, that's the person you're protecting by introducing voter ID. Yes?
For giving way a second time, because as I said to the Shadow Minister earlier on, the point is that the risk of being prevented from voting because of the inability to produce the relevant voter ID is much, much higher than the risk of personation, and that has been borne out by all of the evidence, all of the research, and the honourable gentleman managed to cite one particular instance in Eastleigh. And I put it to him, and I put it to the honourable gentleman for
Northampton.
I beg your pardon, from North Antrim, that the single instance in Eastleigh is likely to be many times outweighed by the number of people who were prevented from voting for these requirements.
Well, I would respectfully suggest that there is probably an unknown and hidden degree of impersonation. How would you know if you can only say, well, there's only been so many people prosecuted? That doesn't mean that there's only so many people impersonating. And the way to rule it out, the way to present hurdles to it, is to have voter ID. And I really do not understand how anyone who wants a clean election, who wants to see only legitimate voters voting, only those votes counted, why anyone who's on that side of things would say, oh, we don't want to have any protections to make sure there's no voter cheating. Surely we should all want to be on the side of preventing the cheating in an election. And it really is a question. Are you on the side of making it more difficult or easier to cheat in an election? And surely we should all be on the side of making it more difficult. And therefore I do strongly defend the voter ID issue. So, returning to the core subject matter, I think it is fitting that in this week of Remembrance Day that we should be adding to the ID list the Veterans Card, and I look forward to that happening in Northern Ireland as well. But I do want to raise a point that a serving soldier sent me a message about, which also touches upon voting. And this is what he wrote. I just want to highlight a further issue that serving members of the armed forces when serving abroad can't exercise their ability to vote due to the inefficiency of the now contracted British Forces Post Office. The length of time to request a postal vote, which is how most service people would vote, and then to send your vote means often you miss the deadline. And then he cites all the countries where servicemen are, and some can be as far away as the Falklands or Germany or Poland or in Africa. And he says, why is it that we cannot have more efficiency in terms of getting postal votes out and back to service people? And that seems to me a legitimate question. And he goes on to say, many other countries provide polling booths in their military bases or in their embassies. Why do we not do that? And I do ask that question of the Minister. Why are we not going further for service personnel who are serving abroad to ensure that they are entitled to participate and do participate in the democratic process? And I think those are important questions that need to be answered, and it's something that this House should give some attention to going forward. Thank you.
Matt Rodda.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak in this afternoon's debate, somewhat briefly though. May I welcome my honourable friend's speech and the measures outlined today, I wanted to just mention 2 points which are of interest to my local residents and others around the country. The first one, as was said earlier, is the importance of parity between veterans and serving personnel. And I do think that's a hugely important point. And it's very timely that this regulation is being debated today and this week. So I do welcome that. I think it's important that we are discussing this afternoon. The second point is really about flexibility and entitlement and the practicality of being able to vote. And I do think that this is an important step forward. There are, in my experience, many people, particularly people who don't have driving licences and maybe don't have an up-to-date passport, who struggle to find the right ID. And in particular, I have come across many residents in Reading who are living on relatively modest incomes, possibly in social housing or other properties where they might move house frequently, who do not have access to ID, who would appreciate existing ID being accredited. And I do think this is a very important step to help those people participate in elections. It's very welcome, it's very timely, and I also welcome the fact that it's happening 6 months before the next set of elections across the UK, such as the county council elections. That's not an election in my own community. We're in a unitary local authority, but nevertheless, for many people, this is timely and it's important, and it will help people participate in democracy, and that's something we should all welcome across the House. So I do welcome it. I think it shows respect to veterans. One particular group I would like to mention is British Gurkhas. We have a large British Gurkha community in Reading. These are former Gurkha soldiers who've become British. They have British nationality. And for many of those living often in the town centre on a relatively modest income, this will be particularly welcomed. So I do want to say a special thank you for that community as well. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The final backbench contribution, Kelvin Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to welcome this motion, which puts right an inconsistency that should never have been implemented in the first place. I'm grateful to the Government for the rapid work that has been done to get us to this point, including that done by my honourable friend, the member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport. I recognise wider concerns about voter ID rules, but I think the Government is right to prioritise this as the first step and keep to our manifesto promise while the wider review continues. That's because, as we know, many veterans face particular challenges when it comes to proving identity in many aspects of civilian life. We veterans are more likely to have moved around regularly and may not have the records or the experience of engagement with civilian authorities like councils, which obviously creates barriers that we need to remove. In my own career, my home base moved around consistently for many years. My driving licence had to refer to my parents' address because it was the only fixed abode I could refer back to. That's typical of many of our service personnel, and we recognise, or should recognise, that service personnel have still fewer fixed connections than they can rely on whilst when they come to leave the forces. And frankly, it can be confusing to come from an environment where your Mod 90, which is a core part of your life, shapes how you engage with all the services and authorities you encounter, and then to be out into the civilian world in a blizzard of forms and applications you simply aren't used to dealing with. The least we can do is to make sure that these processes are easier. Obviously, the rightful first step was introduced with the Veterans Card, but this is clearly of limited use unless it can actually be used and make life easier and less hostile for people leaving our military after completing their service to us all. Society trusts our military IDs. In time, we must learn to continue valuing service and come to trust our veteran IDs in the same way. And we have to ask why it has taken action from this government to correct this mistake and create parity between veterans' cards and the Mod 90. It's shameful to read the leaked reports that the previous Prime Minister deliberately pushed for this barrier to veterans' voting to be kept, based on nothing more than a vague fear that giving in on veterans' card would make it harder to say no to student ID cards too. That just says it all about the decision-making around voter IDs, and so it's more welcome that these rules will be subject to a continuing and wider review. And I must now also address for service personnel the point made by the Honourable Member for North Antrim. This is something which impacted me whilst serving in the United States. The loss of the ability to vote whilst actually upholding the democracy is a terrible affront, and it is something I urge the government to give due consideration to addressing. Fairness and doing the right by those who have served us is vitally important, and that's what our communities want to see. And securing that sense of fairness and integration between the forces and our communities is important too, because of the impact on recruitment and retention, which have been degraded over the past 14 years with real cost to our national defence. So I want to finish with the recognition, which I know my honourable friends on the Treasury bench share fully, that is just one step amongst many that will be needed to remove the barriers that many veterans face in accessing their rights and playing a full role in our communities. We can now look forward to working together on a wider agenda, which is so important for keeping all our people safe.
Yeah. I now call the Minister, Rushanara Ali.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to honourable members for the excellent contributions and to the Shadow Minister for his contribution. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the first of what I hope will be a number of debates on this very important agenda. But today I won't be able to give an exhaustive response to all the comments and contributions that have been made, but I look forward to meeting honourable members and my honourable friends and thanking them for the work they've done in the previous Parliament on this agenda to follow up on specific points they've made. But what I will do is speak to some of the points that have been made. The Shadow Minister raised the issues around the wider policy and what we will do. He will be aware today obviously is a really important part of the work we're doing, and I'm really proud that my party is taking action to make sure that we put in place the changes that are necessary to ensure veterans can exercise their democratic rights, and I'm grateful to colleagues for the work they've done. We will, on the wider points around evaluations from the 2024 general election, the Electoral Commission reports, the previous one as well as the one published today. As I said in my speech, we will look carefully at the proposals and establish what action needs to be taken. We are undertaking a strategic review of electoral registration, conduct and funding processes, looking at the biggest challenges and pain points in the current system, and working in partnership with the election sector to understand how we can address these challenges in a practical and pragmatic manner. I met with recently the head of the Electoral Commission. There are a number of issues in particular. One of the issues that was raised by the Shadow Minister was about raising awareness. Of course, the Electoral Commission has a really important role to play, a positive role to play, not only in terms of awareness among veterans, but also other electors, young people, the support needs of other groups who've been traditionally excluded, and so we look forward to working closely with the Electoral Commission on this very important agenda.
On that point, will the Minister give way?
I give way to my honourable friend.
I thank the Minister for giving way. She's making an excellent point in relation to broadening this out. Great first step with veterans, but broadening this out to other groups, particularly those that are disabled or blind and partially sighted. One of the crucial challenges they face is about being able to vote independently and in secret, but then also having access to the right ID. So does she agree with me that, or will she take this away and make sure in her further conversations she will focus on ensuring that those living with sight loss can vote independently and in secret?
I thank my honourable friend for that contribution. She is a powerful advocate on this agenda, and I'm incredibly proud of the work she's done in raising awareness, and I'm looking forward to working with her and others on making sure that voters are not excluded, particularly voters with disability and visual impairment in particular, and I look forward to working with her and others. As I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will look carefully at the Commission's findings and recommendations from both the reports published and provide a formal response on both reports. The wider points in relation to the UK's election evaluation voter ID. As members will be aware, the Elections Act 2022 includes a requirement for the Secretary of State to publish an evaluation of the implementation of the impact of the voter ID policy on the next local and next 2 UK parliamentary elections. We've contracted IFF Research, an independent research organisation, to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of the 2024 general election. In light of the points that have been made about the ID schemes that were used in these elections, it's really critical that we look at that evidence base and then identify what further action needs to be taken. And I look forward to working with colleagues as this evidence comes through. The point that was made by the Honourable Member for North Antrim in relation to Northern Ireland, it's of course critical that we respect the way elections are run in Northern Ireland and recognise the differences between procedures in Northern Ireland and those in Great Britain. There has been a requirement, as he highlighted, to show voter ID in Northern Ireland since 2002, and there are differences between the lists of accepted documents as well. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland intends to bring forward legislation to add the veteran card to the list of ID documents that may be used in Northern Ireland's polling stations in advance of their next elections in Northern Ireland, which is scheduled to be held in 2027. There have been a number of points made about the impact of voter ID for 16 and 17-year-olds, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend who was a front bench member and her work in speaking to these really important issues. As part of our, Madam Deputy Speaker, our commitment to expanding the voter franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds, we will need to consider if the requirements for identification may be more difficult for younger voters. Some of those concerns have been highlighted today. It's really crucial that the enfranchisement that we want to see doesn't mean that there are barriers. So we look forward to understanding better what that particular younger demographic may need that is different in terms of patterns of ownership of identity documents, and we are considering this as part of our work towards expanding the franchise. Once again, I look forward to hearing from colleagues about their experience as they discuss going forward this important change with young people in their constituencies, and I will be doing the same in my own. My honourable friend and others also raised the issue about accessibility, in particular the support that's needed for those who are disabled voters. We are committed to supporting returning officers to ensure disabled people can participate in elections, and we continue to work closely with organisations representing disabled people and the elections sector to support them to take part in the democratic process. While the blue badge and the disabled persons bus pass are already in place and important, we will of course consider if more can be done to support those electors, because it cannot be right that they are excluded in any way. I give way once again.
And forgive me for expanding this slightly, but Does she agree with me or consider that we should look at other methods of voting, i.e. to be accessible, make sure voting could potentially be done digitally?
I thank my honourable friend for that contribution. This is a very important point, and I don't want to preempt what we do going forward, but I really do very much look forward to her giving input as we conduct this review, and also encourage other colleagues to do the same, because this is a really important agenda and a big opportunity for parliamentarians and others to contribute to the proposals that we consider and come forward with. There were a number of, Madam Deputy Speaker, points made about additional documents. And once again, we will look at these as part of our review. I mentioned young people in particular. My honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, who's also the newly elected chair of the Select Committee, MHCLG Select Committee, raised a number of important points. I'm not going to go through all of them, but look forward to meeting with her and others to pursue this agenda further. She made the point about the current statement. It doesn't reflect the government's priorities, so we clearly won't be leaving it in place. The point she made in relation to changes ahead of May 25 and about commitments to that. It's important that any proposals for electoral changes are properly considered, and that any change in the list of accepted ID is based on sound data. It's also right that electors have certainty and clarity about what is accepted, and that electoral administrators are fully able to take account of any changes. Therefore, we're not going to bring forward further changes for May 2025, and we are taking our time to get this right, and we'll make sure that any further changes are clear and fully considered. And so at this point, we're not committed to a specific time frame. My honourable friend made a comment about the role of British Gurkhas and their contribution. We are all incredibly grateful for their contribution, and it's part of why this is so important, this agenda. And I want to highlight the wider work that this government is doing to support veterans. My honourable friend, the Minister for Veterans and People, he's working with veterans groups and armed forces charities as well as public bodies to promote access and availability of support for veterans, from housing and skills to mental health provision, and also supporting those who want to stand for public office. And I'm delighted to see a number of colleagues across the House who have come from the armed services and joined our Parliament and have made very powerful contributions, including in today's debate. Our work on voter ID for veterans is very much a part of that agenda, and the Veterans Minister will be working closely with me to make sure we widen access and accessibility, but also awareness through those networks. So this SI today is part of the Labour government's work to support veterans, not only in terms of their democratic participation, but also the wider support that they need, and in recognition of the contribution they make to our country, to our security, through their contribution in the armed services. This will also, of course, include the wider commitment that this government has made in putting the Armed Forces Covenant fully into law. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are all justifiably proud of our long history of democracy, but we should never take it for granted. The addition of the veteran card to the list of documents accepted as identification at the polling station will support this important community in engaging in the elections process and in exercising their democratic rights. I hope honourable members will agree these regulations provide for some important changes to our electoral rules, strengthening, widening and securing our democracy into the future. And I hope that honourable members will join me in supporting the veteran community. I'm grateful once again for the contributions from colleagues, and I'm incredibly proud of the fact that it's this government that has introduced these changes, and I commend these regulations to the House.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I'll now give a moment for the front benches to swap over.